Number 2 of the Autism NAS conference. So the next presentation I'd like to discuss is a presentation on loneliness and autism. And there were several presenters here. We had Lisa, I might not be pronouncing her name correctly. We had Lisa Quad, which I think is Quadt, Lisa Quad. She's a research fellow at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School in clinical neuroscience. We had Dr. Gemma Williams, who I think might be autistic, although she didn't mention she was autistic, was just doing a presentation, but on her little bit about each presenter it said she was autistic. So Dr. Gemma Williams, an Economic Social Research Council postdoctoral fellow in social policy at the University of Brighton, and then there was Rachel Fricker, who was an autistic expert by experience, who took part in the research. So I guess research is looking at loneliness and autism, and this is what they found. They found that rates of loneliness are 4 times higher in autistic than non-autistic people. Autistic people have a greater vulnerability to the negative physical and psychological consequences of loneliness. In autistic people, loneliness correlates with increased depression and anxiety. Despite this, there is still a persistent negative stereotype that autistic people are not motivated to seek out meaningful social relationships. So there's often a stereotype that autistic people are happy being alone and that's what they choose, and that they're not going to experience any negative consequences from not having a social network, but that isn't the case, or certainly not always the case. For some, it depends obviously on personality, but just because someone's autistic, it's not always the case that they're going to be happy being on their own. For example, when autistic people do get lonely. Loneliness is subjective. It's often conceptualised as the actual or perceived absence of meaningful social connection. So the size of social networks does not always equate to satisfaction with social relationships. So there's a difference there between emotional loneliness, which is the perceived lack of meaningful connection, and social loneliness or isolation. So in other words, someone could have apparently quite a few friends or quite a few social networks and yet still experience loneliness if they're not connecting with the people in those social networks. So it's more to do with a sense of meaningful connection, and it's subjective. So just because someone doesn't have that many friends, it doesn't always mean that they're lonely, particularly if they see those friendships as quite meaningful. But conversely, someone could have loads of friends and still be very lonely, because it's a subjective thing. And in their research, they asked various questions. Question 1. Do high loneliness rates in autism reflect choosing solitude without distress? That's a stereotype. And to test this out, they did a quantitative case control study. And they asked various questions such as, how often do you feel you are in tune with people around you versus how much does this upset you? How often do you feel you lack companionship, and how much does this upset you? How much are people actually distressed by their loneliness? And that's a separate measure. So they measured loneliness, but also how much are people distressed by the loneliness. And they found that autistics are just as distressed at being lonely than non-autistics, so that refutes the stereotype. Question 2. What is the relationship between mental health and loneliness in non-autistic adults? Loneliness and anxiety is related in autistic, but not in the comparison group. So that was quite interesting, how in autism there is a very strong correlation between anxiety and loneliness, which wasn't seen so much or in the non-autistic comparison group. So in autistics, as loneliness gets higher, anxiety also increases. And they don't yet know what is the causal direction. Does loneliness cause anxiety? Or does anxiety cause loneliness? Obviously, if you're very anxious, that might make it harder for you to meet other people. So that could drive loneliness, where the anxiety is what causes the loneliness. But equally, loneliness itself could make you more anxious. I suspect that it works both ways, in a sort of vicious circle. That's my view. As loneliness distress increases, anxiety increases in the autistic group only, for both loneliness and loneliness distress. Question 3. What is the role of sensory sensitivity? So going out can be very hostile, and that can obviously increase loneliness. So there is a relationship there with the sensory. higher anxiety might be explained by sensory sensitivity, which then explains loneliness. And then they did another study, a qualitative study, where they did 3 short conversations around loneliness with autistic people. So your study was more looking at the quality, of people's actual experiences, as opposed to just collecting data through questionnaires. Theme 1, now 2 different types of loneliness. There's a practical kind, for example, reduced opportunities to meet and spend time with other people and the absence of community spaces, but there's also a deeper yearning, and B, there's also a deeper yearning for meaningful connection with others. So you can still feel lonely in a group of people if you're not on their level. Causes and effects of loneliness. Difficulties in connecting with non-autistic people, difficulties finding others with similar interests, a lack of being understood by wider society. And there's one particular type of loneliness which I hadn't really heard of before, which was quite interesting, called ethical loneliness. And this was coined by Stauffer, might not be pronouncing her name correctly, Jill Stauffer, that's Stauffer, Stauffer, 2015. Jill Stauffer coined the term ethical loneliness, and this is a feeling of alienation from the world, a result of being rejected or abandoned by society. It was originally used in connection with with prisoners of war, political prisoners, things like that, but it has wider ramifications. So you feel dehumanised by other individuals or wider political structures, and you are ignored when you try to speak out about it or seek help. A violated person or member of a persecuted group has been abandoned by humanity or by those who have power over one's life possibilities, and this is compounded by the experience of not being heard, and that can result in minority stress and a feeling of being othered. And they quoted an autistic academic called Monique Beaufort, who talks about minority stress. I found that very interesting. I hadn't really heard of ethical loneliness before, and it certainly makes sense to me. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because there's quite a lot of information that I've just delivered from the presentation, and as I say, there's still a lot to cover, and in the next video I will talk about Rachel Fricker's presentation, which was very interesting, as Rachel Fricker took part in a loneliness study. She's autistic, lives in Brighton, I think, and talks about her own experience of loneliness. I actually thought the loneliness presentation was one of the more interesting presentations, although it was right at the very end of the conference. I was kind of feeling a bit tired by that point, but thankfully I could go back and have a look at it again, because all of the talks are on demand for up to a month for people who attended the conference, so I have gone back and looked at them again. And there were also some presentations that weren't live, which I will also cover as well. Interestingly, by the way, all of the autistic presenters were women, which I found quite interesting, particularly as historically women have been underdiagnosed. It's almost like, I don't know whether that's deliberate, but all of the autistic presenters on there were women, which is quite interesting. All late diagnosed, But yeah, so let me know what you think, and I'll carry on talking about the conference very soon, so thank you for watching.